What is podcasting and why has it become a thing? From Merriam-Webster, the definition of podcasting is, quote, a program as of music or talk made available in digital format for automatic download over the internet. Put simply, podcasting is online audio streaming. More technically, it's distributing audio files via a RSS feed. You can think of podcasting as recording a piece of audio and streaming it via only the internet. Podcasting is not streaming through radio waves or any type of traditional broadcast. It is streaming purely via the internet. Radio and TV can now be streamed via the internet, but their main mediums are still from cable and radio waves. One fun fact, radio is the largest media in the United States, even beating out television. 92% of Americans listen to the radio compared to 87% of Americans watching television. Radio is still a massive audience, however, it's starting to decline after being really stable for a decade or more. In 2019, 89% of Americans over the age of 12 listened to the radio once a week, and in 2020, 83% of Americans over the age of 12 listened to the radio once a week. Could some of that be because of the COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020? Most likely, yes, but COVID seemed to accelerate trends rather than create them. That leads us to podcasting. What happened to podcasting these last couple years as radio listenership was declining? Podcasting has been increasing, not dramatically, but is definitely on an upward trajectory when it comes to listenership. In 2020, 24% of Americans over the age of 12 listened to a podcast once a week, while in 2021, 28% of Americans over the age of 12 listened to a podcast once a week. So the growth of podcasting doesn't equate exactly to the decline of radio, but it's similar enough. Now, why has podcasting been becoming a thing and growing the way it has? Well, a few reasons. One, it's become way more convenient than years past. There are way more dedicated apps to podcasts nowadays, and downloading a podcast isn't a big deal any longer. The cost of storing data is much cheaper than when podcasts started in 2004. Two, podcasting fits into a lot of people's daily lives pretty seamlessly. For example, 49% of podcast listening happens at home and 22% happens while driving. So over 70% of podcast listening is happening when we're washing the dishes, working on personal tasks at home, or just driving to work 5 days a week. Podcasts fit right into our daily lives seamlessly, especially with them downloading straight to your favorite podcasting app automatically. You know when you load up Apple Podcasts or Spotify that what you want to listen to will be right there waiting for you. It's so convenient. Third, there's been a lot of an investment into podcasts these past couple years. Spotify, just Spotify, not Apple or any other tech company, has invested over $1 billion into podcasts. As Chief Content and Advertising Business Officer Don Ostroff has said, at Spotify, the company expects podcasts to be a $20 billion opportunity. This has led to not only platforms optimizing for podcasts, but a lot more people and brands creating higher quality podcasts. Yes, in theory, you can just record a podcast with just your iPhone, but really the podcasts that are being, quote, successful are ones that have a decent setup. Not necessarily $1 million studio type setup, but a good quality setup with the right equipment. That leads me to my next point. What do you actually need to get started with a podcast? I'm going to break this down into 3 different levels of equipment: beginner, intermediate, and professional. Yes, these get more expensive as we go up, but none of these are unreasonable when it comes to pricing. You can have a pretty professional setup for a few $1,000s. In the grand scheme of things, that's actually pretty impressive. Starting with the beginner level, you'll need 3 things. First is a lavalier mic, or AKA a lav mic, which you can pick up on Amazon for about $20. 2 is a podcast host. This could be free through Anchor, but I would stay away from Anchor because you kind of don't own your own podcast through them. They manage everything and don't give you access to all the different podcast streaming services. Even in this beginner level, I would jump up to a Buzzsprout or my personal favorite, Transistor, for about $20 a month. The last thing you'll need for this beginner level is a recording software. If it's just you and another host in person, you could just use a tool like GarageBand for free if you have a Mac. If you're having remote guests, you'll need a service like Squadcast, or the one that's getting a lot of love these days, Riverside. Next is the intermediate level. Just like in the beginner level, you'll still need a podcast host like Transistor, which works great at this level, and a recording software. Again, Riverside would work great. The number one item I would upgrade at this intermediate level is the microphone. Lav mics work, but I always see them as risky. All it takes is it moving into an awkward position on your shirt, and all of a sudden your audio is muffled. The audio quality can be pretty good, especially for just getting started, but personally, I'm always nervous when I'm using them. I would upgrade it to a Rode or Shure USB microphone. The one I would personally go with would be the Shure MV7 podcast microphone. You can plug it straight into your computer, which could up your Zoom game for regular Zoom calls too, and has the ability to plug into a mixer board using a XLR cable as you grow into an even more professional setup. Speaking of that professional setup, let's just jump into what a professional setup would be. Just like in the intermediate level, I would keep using Transistor for hosting and Riverside for recording. Both are great and can handle large podcasts. If you buy the Shure MV7 podcast microphone, you're probably okay, truthfully. Instead of connecting it to your computer though, you might want to plug it into a mixer board instead. Mixers are really helpful, particularly when everyone is recording in person. Mixers help you have consistent audio levels throughout your recording of a podcast and give you some better quality than recording through your computer. I personally use the first version of the Rodecaster Pro, and that's worked wonderfully. They just released the Rodecaster Pro 2, which I just assume is amazing based on how great this first version of it has been. The last item I would add to a professional podcasting setup would be a camera. I am by no means a camera expert, but a high quality camera recording video of you while you're recording a podcast is becoming much more important, especially with YouTube driving a lot of growth for podcasts in the last year or so. You can use a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or even one of the new hyped up webcams like Opal. We've now covered what podcasting is and why has it become a thing and why you need to get started with a podcast. Let's now go over why you should consider podcasting for yourself. There's two main reasons why you should consider podcasting for yourself: brand building and the opportunity at the moment when it comes to podcasting. Let's start with brand building. If you start a podcast with you as the only host, you're building quite the personal brand. First, that every guest you bring on is building your personal network, and if you chat with them for 30 minutes, you're on track to build a pretty good relationship with the person you're interviewing. Yes, when you get started, it's most likely a lot of your own personal network to start, but eventually, if not in the beginning, you need to do a lot of cold outreach to people that you wouldn't have connected with otherwise. These people can help create more opportunities for you later, whether that's job opportunities or even potential partnerships down the road as you grow your podcast. Second, podcasting is a really intimate experience for listeners. If you have a weekly podcast and the average length of your podcast is 35 minutes, that means a good amount of your listeners are listening to you every week for 35 minutes in their earbuds or in their car. That listener builds a strong relationship with you, the host, because if they're, quote, talking to you on a weekly basis, it feels like you know them pretty well. For example, I love the Low Post podcast with Zach Lowe. I've become much more of a basketball junkie these last few years, and mentally, I feel like Zach Lowe is a good friend because of the amount of podcasts I have listened to by him. It's honestly become slightly odd as I know he's living in the same state as I am, Connecticut, and he's even mentioned in his last podcast that he'll be in Austria next month. Why do I remember that? Because if someone is in your ears for 35 minutes or more each week, they're not a stranger. Zach Lowe feels like a good friend, even though I've never actually met the man. This intimacy makes podcasts prime for sponsorships. If your listener trusts the host and the host suggests a product or service, there's a really high chance that product or service will be remembered and purchased in the future. The data backs that up too. According to research done by Nielsen, 62% of podcast listeners recall the brand advertised in a podcast. 69% of podcast listeners agree that the podcast ad experienced in the study made them aware of new product or services. And 62% of podcast listeners agree that the podcast ad experienced in the study made them consider new product or services. These metrics around how ads are memorable is going to help you and other podcasts monetize a whole lot easier than other mediums like blogs or YouTube. Ads in other mediums just don't cause the same memorable experiences like podcasts do. Besides the sponsorship opportunities, we're still in the very early stages of podcasts, and opportunities are all over the place. Podcasts were born in 2004, so this podcast industry is still less than 20 years old. For some context, the first commercially available computers were available starting in 1946. Computers are 58 years older than podcasts, and it took decades for computers to really become mainstream. Like I mentioned earlier, 28% of Americans over the age of 12 are currently listening to podcasts on a weekly basis. A few decades from now, that number seems to surely be much higher. It could be doubled or even tripled. Plus, platforms like YouTube are just now starting to create a podcasting strategy, which will only increase the amount of opportunities podcasts have. If you want to learn more about how YouTube is approaching podcasts, I'll put a link to the 2022 priorities down in the description below. The last point I want to leave you with is that it doesn't take much to be an above average podcast if you stick with it. According to Buzzsprout, the median 50% of podcasts have 29 downloads in their first 7 days. So if you have 30 weekly listeners to your podcast, you are already in the top half of podcast. It takes 96 listeners in the first week to be in the top 25%, and just over 4,500 weekly listeners to be in the top 1% of podcasts. In the grand scheme of things, those numbers are small and very doable. You just have to stick with it and produce a quality podcast. If you found this video helpful, I would love it if you can give it a like down below. And if you're looking for more videos like this, check out other videos on this channel, like this one here.